Inheriting a decaying Victorian mansion was supposed to solve Coralie's crushing debt, but it unlocked a deadly 30-year-old mafia secret instead. When arrogant enforcers arrive to claim a forgotten fortune, they violently underestimate the brilliant architect waiting to serve them a brutal dose of hard karma behind the peeling wallpaper. Sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of a downtown Philadelphia law firm, Coralie Newman felt entirely out of place. Her worn canvas sneakers sank into the plush, cream-colored carpet, and her anxiety mounted with every tick of the brass grandfather clock in the corner. Across the massive desk sat Oakley Finch, a seasoned estate attorney whose perfectly tailored navy suit made Coralie acutely aware of her own frayed sweater. Coralie was 32, a freelance architectural draftsperson who had spent the last 5 years drowning in a sea of medical debt. Her mother's prolonged battle with early-onset dementia had drained every meager saving Coralie had managed to scrape together, leaving her facing imminent eviction from her cramped studio apartment. Survival had become her only daily objective. "As I mentioned on the phone, Miss Newman," Oakley Finch began, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses, "your great-aunt Amelia Wright passed away 3 weeks ago. She was a deeply private woman, but she explicitly named you as the sole beneficiary of her estate." Coralie blinked, trying to process the words. She had not seen Amelia Wright since she was 7 years old. The woman was the black sheep of her mother's family, a recluse who had mysteriously severed all ties with her relatives in the late 1980s. "Her estate?" Coralie asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't think she had anything. My mother always said Amelia lived like a pauper." Oakley opened a thick manila folder and slid a set of heavy antique brass keys across the polished wood. "Your great-aunt owned a property outright. It is a 3-story Victorian home located at 412 Lafayette Street in Cape May, New Jersey. The property taxes are fully paid through the end of the year. It is yours, Coralie, to live in, to rent, or to sell." The drive down the Garden State Parkway felt like a surreal dream. A house in Cape May. If the property was even halfway decent, selling it could wipe out her crushing debts and offer her a fresh start. But as Coralie pulled her battered Honda Civic up to the curb of Lafayette Street later that afternoon, her fragile hope began to fracture. Number 412 is a colossal, brooding structure that seemed to sag under its own weight. Once painted a vibrant seafoam green, the exterior was now a mosaic of peeling, graying wood. Overgrown ivy choked the wraparound porch, and several of the ornate stained glass windows on the second floor were shattered, patched haphazardly with black garbage bags and duct tape. The yard was a jungle of thorny briars and dead weeds. Taking a deep breath, Coralie climbed the groaning wooden steps and inserted the heavy brass key into the rusted lock. It turned with a harsh screech. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The smell hit her instantly, a heavy, suffocating mixture of damp wood, stale air, and something distinctly metallic, like old pennies. Coralie stepped into the foyer and fumbled for a light switch, but flipping it yielded nothing. The electricity had clearly been shut off. Pulling a high-powered tactical flashlight from her tote bag, she clicked it on and swept the beam across the interior. Amelia Wright had not just been a recluse, she had been a severe hoarder. The grand parlor to the left was entirely consumed by precarious towers of old newspapers, some dating back to the 1970s. Broken grandfather clocks lined the walls, their glass faces shattered, pendulums frozen in time. In the dining room, a massive mahogany table was buried beneath mountains of rusted bird cages, tarnished silver trays, and dozens of manual typewriters. Narrow, winding pathways had been carved through the debris, barely wide enough for one person to pass. Coralie felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. The house wasn't a quick flip, it was a monumental liability. Clearing this out would take weeks and thousands of dollars in dumpster rental fees, money she absolutely did not have. She spent the next few hours navigating the labyrinth of junk on the ground floor, her mind racing with desperate calculations. She would have to do the heavy lifting herself. She would camp out in the house, clean it room by room, and pray the structural integrity of the Victorian wasn't as compromised as its aesthetic. That night, she set up a sleeping bag in the kitchen, the only room with enough clear floor space, and listened to the house settle. The coastal wind howled off the Atlantic, rattling the loose window panes and sending eerie moaning drafts through the chimney. Coralie lay awake, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling, wondering who Amelia Wright truly was and why she had chosen to live in a self-made tomb of forgotten objects. By the morning of her 4th day in Cape May, Coralie's hands were blistered and her back ached with a deep, persistent throb. She had managed to clear the parlor, hauling dozens of heavy trash bags out to a commercial dumpster she had convinced a local waste management company to let her pay for, on a deferred billing plan. Armed with a tape measure, a clipboard, and a renewed sense of grim determination, Coralie moved to the 2nd floor to assess the bedrooms. A local real estate agent, a brisk woman named Brenda Hughes, had warned Coralie that knowing the exact square footage of the upper floors was crucial for an accurate appraisal, especially given the home's dilapidated state. Coralie started in the rear guest bedroom, hooking her tape measure to the baseboard and walking it across the faded, floral, patterned carpet. 14 feet, she muttered, jotting it down. She moved out into the main hallway, running the tape from the edge of the guest room door to the threshold of the massive master suite at the front of the house. 22 feet. She frowned, looking at the numbers on her clipboard. She walked into the master suite and measured from the hallway wall to the exterior front windows. 16 feet. Coralie stood in the center of the dusty hallway, tapping her pen against her chin. Her background in architectural drafting made her spatially intuitive, and the math was glaringly wrong. The hallway was 22 feet long. The adjacent wall in the master bedroom accounted for 16 feet, and the guest room accounted for roughly 2 feet of closet space. That left an unaccounted-for gap of exactly 4 feet. 4 feet of missing space right in the middle of the 2nd floor. She walked over to the wall connecting the hallway to the master suite. It was covered in hideous, peeling wallpaper depicting yellow chrysanthemums. Coralie pressed the palm of her hand flat against the floral pattern. The wall felt solid, standard lath and plaster. She balled her hand into a fist and knocked firmly against it. Thud. 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 Solid. She moved 2 feet to the left, standing precisely where the missing void should be, and knocked again. Thump. Thump. Hollow. Coralie's breath hitched. The sound reverberated slightly, echoing off a cavity behind the plaster. She pressed her ear to the wall, hearing nothing but the distant sound of the ocean wind, but her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Houses of this era often had laundry chutes or dumbwaiters, but a void this large didn't make sense. Adrenaline overriding her exhaustion, Coralie hurried downstairs and retrieved a heavy steel crowbar and a sledgehammer from her toolkit. Returning to the 2nd floor, she took a steadying breath, squared her stance, and swung the sledgehammer. The heavy iron head smashed through the lath and plaster with a deafening crack. Decades-old plaster chunks exploded outward in a cloud of white, choking debris. Coralie coughed, waving her hands to clear the air, and peered into the jagged hole. Darkness stared back. She widened the hole, using the crowbar to rip away the splintered wooden lath until the opening was large enough to step through. Grabbing her tactical flashlight, she ducked her head and crossed the threshold into the hidden space. The air inside was radically different from the rest of the house. It was bone-dry, smelling strongly of mothballs, old leather, and gun oil. Coralie swept her flashlight beam around, gasping at the sight. It was a windowless, narrow room, measuring precisely 4 by 8 feet. Unlike the chaotic hoarding in the rest of the house, this space was meticulously organized. In the center sat a heavy, olive-green metal desk, the kind used in military offices during the mid-20th century. Behind the desk was a massive, black iron safe embedded directly into the brickwork of the chimney breast. Coralie approached the desk, her flashlight trembling in her grip. On the surface lay a single, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of meticulously handwritten numbers and dates, stretching from 1978 to 1994. Beside the numbers were abbreviations that made no sense. ZAR-H Dep, Kai Trans, LIS Hold. Next to the ledger sat a heavy, waterproof canvas duffel bag. The heavy brass zipper was stiff, but Coralie managed to yank it open. Inside, stacked in impossibly neat rows, were thick bundles of paper. Coralie reached in and pulled one out. Her stomach dropped to the floor. It was a brick of United States currency, $100 bills bound in heavy rubber bands. But they weren't modern bills. They were old-style currency, crisp and uncirculated. Coralie dug deeper into the bag. Beneath the American currency were similar bundles of colorful foreign money: Swiss francs, German marks, and British pounds. There had to be hundreds of thousands of dollars in this single bag. Trembling violently now, Coralie moved her light to a smaller wooden cigar box resting on the corner of the desk. She flipped the brass clasp and opened the lid. Inside was a stack of dark blue vintage passports. She opened the first one. The photograph was undeniably her great-aunt Amelia, though much younger, perhaps in her late 30s, her hair styled in a severe bob. But the name printed next to the photo was Margaret Lewis, an American citizen. Coralie grabbed the second passport, British. The same photograph of Amelia, but the name read Victoria Vance. A third passport, Canadian. Eleanor Sterling. What were you involved in, Amelia? Coralie whispered into the suffocating silence of the hidden room, a cold dread washing over her. The narrative of the eccentric, impoverished hoarder was a lie. Amelia Wright was hiding from someone, or something, and she had built this fortress to protect her secrets. Suddenly the heavy silence of the house was shattered by 3 sharp, aggressive knocks echoing from the heavy oak front door downstairs. Coralie froze, her flashlight clicking off instantly. She stood in the pitch-black void, scarcely daring to breathe. Nobody knew she was here except the real estate agent and the lawyer, neither of whom would pound on the door like they were trying to break it down. She crept out of the hidden room, stepping carefully over the plaster rubble, and tiptoed into the master bedroom to peek through the shattered window overlooking the street. Parked at the curb directly behind her beat-up Civic was a sleek, jet-black Mercedes SUV with heavily tinted windows. Standing on the porch below, partially obscured by the porch roof, was a tall man in a charcoal gray suit. Coralie backed away from the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She had just discovered a fortune in untraceable cash, a dozen fake identities, and a ledger that looked like an international money laundering record. And now, a stranger was at the door. Knock! 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 Miss Newman, a deep, authoritative voice boomed from the porch, carrying easily through the thin walls of the decaying house. I know you're in there. My name is Gregory Holt, and we need to have a very serious conversation about the property you just inherited. More specifically, about what your aunt agreed to leave behind for me. Coralie stared at the jagged hole in the wall, the hidden room beckoning from the shadows. The unexpected inheritance wasn't a gift, it was a target on her back. Footsteps creaked heavily on the porch boards below, shattering Coralie's momentary paralysis. Panic flared in her chest, hot and blinding, but years of navigating the relentless pressure of medical debt and eviction notices had forged a profound resilience within her. Survival instinct quickly suppressed the terror. She could not let this man know about the breached wall. Grabbing a massive, moth-eaten Persian rug from the hallway floor, Coralie hoisted it up and hastily draped it over the jagged hole in the plaster, securing the heavy fabric by dragging a cast-iron floor lamp in front of it. It was a flimsy, desperate disguise, but it had to suffice in the dim, natural light of the hallway. Taking a deep, steadying breath to calm her racing pulse, Coralie wiped the white plaster dust from her jeans and began her descent down the grand, sweeping staircase. She deliberately slowed her pace, adopting the posture of an exhausted, overwhelmed woman, merely trying to clean up her deceased aunt's tragic mess. She unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open just enough to peer out. Gregory Holt stood with his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored charcoal suit. Up close, his features were sharp and predatory, his dark eyes sweeping over Coralie with undisguised contempt. He looked at her frayed sweater and dust-covered hair, instantly categorizing her as insignificant and minor, easily manipulated obstacle. "Miss Newman," Holt said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr, "I apologize for the intrusion during your time of mourning, but I represent a man named Arthur Carmichael, a very successful, very powerful businessman operating out of Chicago. Your great-aunt Amelia and Mr. Carmichael had a business arrangement many years ago, an arrangement that was left unresolved when she abruptly relocated." "I don't know who Arthur Carmichael is," Coralie replied, keeping her voice timid and wavering. "And my aunt didn't leave anything behind but garbage." As you can see, she was profoundly unwell. She gestured to the parlor, where the towering walls of rotting newspapers and rusted bird cages were clearly visible from the threshold. Holt's lips curled into a condescending smirk. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, invading her personal space. "Amelia Wright was a lot of things, sweetheart, but crazy wasn't one of them. She was Carmichael's chief forensic accountant in the late 1980s. She handled the logistics for private, untaxed acquisitions, and before she vanished, she absconded with a highly sensitive black ledger, along with a substantial amount of Mr. Talv, Carmichael's liquid assets." Coralie forced herself to look confused, widening her eyes. "An accountant? My mother said she was a secretary who lost her mind." "Look, Mr. Holt, there are no ledgers here. I've been sorting through decades of literal trash. If there was money, the electricity wouldn't have been shut off for non-payment. People hide in plain sight, Miss Norman," Holt countered, his tone hardening, dropping the polite facade. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, embossed business card, snapping it between his fingers before shoving it into Coralie's hand. "Mr. Carmichael is a patient man, but his patience expired 3 decades ago. You have exactly 24 hours. Tear this dump apart. Find the black ledger and the lockbox. If you don't call me by tomorrow noon with good news, my associates and I will return. And we will dismantle this house down to the foundation, with or without your cooperation." Without waiting for a response, Holt turned on his heel, descended the porch steps, and slid into the back of the idling black Mercedes. Coralie watched the vehicle glide away down Lafayette Street before slamming the heavy oak door and throwing the deadbolt. Her hands were shaking violently now, but her mind was fiercely sharp. The narrative of her family history had just been rewritten in blood and stolen millions. Amelia Wright wasn't a tragic hoarder. She was a criminal mastermind who had embezzled from a major organized crime syndicate and used the facade of insanity to ensure nobody would ever come looking for a fortune in a house filled with garbage. Coralie sprinted back up the stairs, throwing aside the Persian rug and diving back into the hidden room. She ignored the canvas bag of cash that was a secondary concern now. The real power, and her only leverage, was locked inside the massive iron safe embedded in the chimney. She stared at the heavy brass dial. Safes of this vintage rarely had complex electronic bypasses. It was all mechanical. She grabbed the black ledger from the desk, flipping frantically through the pages. The columns of offshore accounts and transferred sums were staggering, proving Arthur Carmichael had laundered hundreds of millions through legitimate shell companies. But there were no obvious combinations scrawled in the margins. Coralie paced the narrow 4x8 room. Amelia was a woman of calculated precision. If she left the money and the ledger out in the open, she intended for them to be found by whoever broke through the wall. But the safe was different. The safe was a vault for the endgame. What did Amelia leave behind that I would know? Coralie thought frantically. What connects us? Coralie dug her phone out of her pocket and opened her digital archives, pulling up the digital scan of Amelia's last will and testament that Oakley Finch had emailed her. She scoured the document. Standard legal boilerplate. Nothing stood out until she looked at the date of the signature. The will was drafted and signed on October 14, 1994. Coralie looked at the ledger on the desk. The final entry, written in stark red ink, was dated October 13, 1994. The day Amelia finished dismantling Arthur Carmichael's financial empire. The day before she signed the house over to Coralie, knowing she would eventually need an heir to finish the job. Coralie dropped to her knees in front of the iron safe. She gripped the cold brass dial. 10 right. 14 left. 94 right. She grasped the heavy iron handle and pulled. With a heavy metallic groan, the locking mechanism disengaged and the thick door swung open. Inside the safe there was no money. Instead, there was a neat stack of sealed manila envelopes, dozens of microcassette tapes, and a small velvet jeweler's pouch. On top of it all rested a handwritten letter inside a plastic sleeve, boldly addressed to the heir of 420 Flaviet. Coralie carefully removed the letter and unfolded the crisp, aged parchment. If you are reading this, I am dead, and Carmichael's hounds have likely found the scent. I live my life in the shadows of arrogant, violent men, balancing their books while they destroyed lives. Arthur Carmichael thought I was just a quiet woman with a calculator. He underestimated me. I spent 5 years siphoning his untraceable emergency reserves and documenting every murder, every bribe, and every extortion racket his syndicate executed. The money in the canvas bag is yours. It is untraceable, washed through 12 different shell corporations. Consider it compensation for the burden I have placed upon you. But the contents of this safe are the true inheritance. The tapes contain Carmichael's own voice-ordering executions. The documents trace his legitimate businesses directly to cartel money. I hoarded junk in this house to keep the locals away, but I built this room to trap a monster. Do not run. Men like Holt will hunt you to the ends of the earth. You must destroy them. Use the house. Use the evidence. Deliver the karma they have so desperately earned. Coralie lowered the letter. She reached into the safe and picked up the velvet pouch, loosening the drawstrings. A cascade of brilliant, flawless loose diamonds spilled into her palm, glittering sharply in the beam of her flashlight. Holt thought she was a desperate, impoverished girl who would fold under the slightest pressure. He thought he held all the power. Coralie felt a cold, dangerous smile spread across her face. He was about to learn the same lesson Arthur Carmichael had learned 3 decades ago. Never underestimate the quiet woman in the room. Shadows draped the old Victorian in a suffocating darkness as midnight approached. The coastal wind whipped against the shattered windows, creating a chaotic symphony of rattling glass and groaning timber. Inside, Coralie Nyman was entirely in her element. She was an architectural draftsperson. She understood weight distribution, structural integrity, and spatial dynamics better than anyone. And over the last 12 hours she had turned Amelia's hoarded labyrinth into a weaponized fortress. She had not called Holt. She knew his 24-hour deadline was a psychological tactic. Arrogant men like him never waited. They preferred the terror of a midnight ambush. Sitting in the darkness of the second-floor landing, Coralie monitored the front yard through a crack in the boarded-up window. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the black Mercedes SUV glided silently to the curb, its headlights extinguished. 3 men emerged, Holt looking infuriated in a dark trench coat, and 2 massive, thick-necked enforcers carrying crowbars and heavy flashlights. They didn't bother knocking. One of the enforcers drove a pry bar into the seam of the front door, shattering the rusted locking mechanism with a brutal crunch. The heavy oak door swung open, and the 3 men stepped into the suffocating, garbage-filled foyer. "Spread out," Holt commanded in a hushed, furious whisper. "She's playing games. Find the girl, break something she needs to walk, and find that ledger." From her perch on the landing, Coralie pulled a heavy pair of industrial noise-canceling earmuffs over her ears and tightened her grip on a thick rope she had secured around the banister. The rope snaked down the stairs and disappeared into the treacherous mountains of junk in the grand parlor. Holt's men advanced into the house, their flashlight beams cutting erratically through the dust-choked air. They were heavy-footed and clumsy, entirely unprepared for the sheer volume of debris. One of the enforcers forced his way into the dining room, cursing loudly as he tripped over a rusted birdcage, his immense weight crashing into a precarious, 8-foot-tall tower of manual typewriters. Coralie didn't wait. She yanked the thick rope with every ounce of strength she possessed. The rope was tied to the foundational base of the largest garbage structure in the house, a solid wall of tightly bound, waterlogged encyclopedias and heavy mahogany furniture that Coralie had meticulously undermined earlier that evening. The structural failure was instantaneous and catastrophic. With a deafening roar that shook the very floorboards of the Victorian, the 12-foot wall of hoarding collapsed. Thousands of pounds of deadweight avalanched directly into the narrow pathway where the 2 enforcers were standing. The men didn't even have time to scream before they were completely buried beneath a crushing tidal wave of heavy wood, rusted metal, and decades of decaying paper. Holt, who had lingered near the foyer, stumbled backward, coughing violently as a massive cloud of toxic gray dust exploded into the air, blinding him. "You little bitch," Holt roared, pulling a suppressed pistol from his coat, coughing and wiping his tearing eyes. He aimed blindly toward the staircase. "I'll kill you." Coralie remained perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched as Holt, panicked and disoriented by the collapse and the choking dust, took a step backward to regain his footing. He stepped exactly where Coralie had calculated he would. Earlier, Coralie had used her sledgehammer to completely compromise the floor joists beneath the antique Persian rug in the foyer, the very rug she had initially used to cover the wall upstairs. She had moved it to cover a 5x5 section of rotted floorboards resting over the deep, unfinished basement. As Holt's leather shoe came down with all his weight, the compromised floorboards gave way with a sickening, splintering crack. Holt shrieked as the floor simply vanished beneath him. He plummeted 10 feet into the pitch-black basement, landing with a brutal, bone-snapping crunch onto the concrete floor below. His pistol clattered harmlessly into the darkness. A low, agonizing groan drifted up from the abyss, followed by utter silence. Coralie exhaled a long, trembling breath. She pulled off the earmuffs, retrieved her backpack, which was now heavily laden with the canvas bag of cash, the diamonds, the ledger, and the manila envelopes of evidence, and calmly walked down the stairs. She completely ignored the groans coming from the buried enforcers in the parlor and the whimpering emanating from the basement hole. She stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the crisp, clean ocean air, and pulled her cell phone from her pocket. She dialed a number she had memorized from one of Amelia's meticulously typed dossiers. A direct line to Detective Harrison Miller, a federal agent Amelia had identified in her notes as the only uncorrupted investigator hunting Carmichael in the 90s. Miller, a gruff, sleepy voice, answered on the third ring. "Detective Miller," Coralie said, her voice steady and clear. "My name is Coralie Neumann. I am standing at 42012 Lafayette Street in Cape May. I have the complete, unredacted financial ledgers of Arthur Carmichael, microcassette recordings of his extortion orders, and the banking routes for his offshore cartels. I also have 3 armed intruders incapacitated in my home. I suggest you bring a heavily armed tactical team and a very large transport van." 6 months later, the arrest of Arthur Carmichael dominated the national news cycle. The billionaire businessman was dragged from his Chicago penthouse in handcuffs, his entire empire dismantled overnight by a mountain of irrefutable, decades-old evidence provided by an anonymous source. Gregory Holt, recovering from 2 shattered legs, eagerly turned state's evidence against his boss to avoid a life sentence. As for the Victorian at 42012 Lafayette Street, it was seized by the city after the police raid, deemed an unlivable biohazard, and eventually bulldozed. Thousands of miles away, sitting on the sun-drenched balcony of a luxury villa overlooking the Amalfi Coast, Coralie Neumann sipped a glass of vintage wine. Her medical debts were entirely erased. She was working strictly for pleasure now, drafting designs for local coastal properties. Next to her on the glass table sat a velvet pouch, slightly lighter than it had been 6 months ago, but still holding enough flawless diamonds to ensure she would never have to worry about surviving another day in her life. Amelia Wright had finally settled her accounts, and Coralie had collected the absolute undeniable balance. Did this jaw-dropping story of hidden millions and mafia secrets keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this unbelievable true-life tale of karma, revenge, and survival, hit that like button right now. Share this video with your friends who love a good mystery, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories. Drop a comment below.